Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, it is time for another movie review, and this time I am tackling the 1960 classic, directed by the king of the auteurs himself, at least in America, Alfred Hitchcock. This, of course, is Psycho. Now, by the late 50s, Hitch was pretty well known. Now, this was at the very end of the golden age of Hollywood, when it was about to transition into the Hollywood New Wave, depending on what year you go by. In the old school Hollywood, with a couple exceptions, most of the time when people went to the theater, it was because of the name of the movie and or the people attached to it. The big Hollywood stars, the macho men with lots of sex appeal, and the ladies that were very demure, very mindful, a little bit opinionated depending on which one we're talking about, but also graceful and with their own sex appeal. They went for them, not so much for the director, unless you were like a big cinephile nerd, where you're like, oh, actually that was directed by blah blah blah, and they used that blah 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 lens on that film, that type of film nerd. Hitchcock, of course, being one of the big outliers, makes sense, because he was one of the very big auteurs during this period, which, if you don't know what auteur theory is, it is the film theory that if you look at the film, even though it's a collaborative art, but if you look at it as there has to be one person credited as the sole creative force, it is a director. They'll work with all the other moving pieces, but at the end of the day, it is their vision. Now, there are times within Hollywood where that's a little bit harder, because the movie studios always be like, eh. Sometimes good, sometimes not so good. Hitchcock, of course, was one of those ones, especially at this time in his career, where he had a lot of stroke where he was able to push back. But in the case of this film, that pushback, he kind of hit a little bit of a wall, but he decided to burst through that wall anyway. Now, by this point in his career, like I said, everybody basically knew who he was. And his films were doing alright. I mean, his previous film before this was North by Northwest, considered one of his classics. Great film with Cary Grant. Oh, I got to review it one of these days. Has a couple classic scenes in there. There's a crop duster scene, then of course the climax where they're going up into Mount Rushmore. But his previous film, while now considered his magnum opus, it was not looked at fondly by critics when it came out, and of course it didn't make its money back. That, of course, is Vertigo. Now, both of those things have one thing in common, other than the fact that they're directed by Hitchcock. They have big stars, and for their time, their budgets were up there. Now, Hitch, he was getting a little tired of having to direct these films with the big stars, mainly because big stars equals big bucks that they require. I mean, that's one thing that definitely hasn't changed. I mean, as an example, look at the MCU. As it's gotten bigger and bigger, so have the salaries for a lot of its names. I mean, just look how much Robert Downey Jr. has been paid for all the films he was in. Regardless of whether you like the films or not, you got to bring that up. Now, Hitch wanted to find some new material, especially since two film projects he'd been trying to do, basically, and as far as I know, they haven't been made. Now, his longtime assistant found this little book by a horror writer named Robert Bloch. Now, Bloch was a former pen pal of the legendary H.P. Lovecraft earlier in his career, and by this point, settled into a nice career, and he wrote the book Psycho. Now, in interviews, Bloch has always denied it, but looking at it, you can see that he drew some inspiration, even if subconsciously, because of the cultural zeitgeist, because of how close he was to where this person lived, but he drew inspiration from Ed Gein. And that is mainly in the form of the character of Norman Bates, is that they're both older men, live by themselves, they were raised by a domineering mother who, even though she's passed away, a little spoiler there, really has her hooks in the son. Now, Hitch's assistant was like, oh yeah, this will be good. Now, before Hitch even got the book, Paramount, who he was making his films for at the time, were already like, yeah, I don't know, due to the subject matter, because the book is a little bit more graphic. Like, there's a lot more scenes of Norman actually looking at pornography, and he's also interested in the occult. That latter one is not even the movie at all, and then the former is only implied in a later scene. Hitch got his hands on the book, read through it, and was like, yeah, this is some great material. So he really fought for it to be made. For starters, he had his assistants buy up as many copies of Psycho as he could get because he didn't want people to know the ending of that movie until they saw it in the theater, which is a good thing, especially since that ending really helps make the movie. I mean, it's one of the moments in the film that people, just by cultural osmosis, know about now, so the twist might not work as much unless you put yourself in the mindset of having never seen the movie and then put all that aside. The shower scene is definitely another one, as is the staircase scene. Now, Hitch really went to bat against the studio. They did not want to make it, and they were denying his usual amount of money, even though he wanted to make it a little bit more on the down low without expensive stars. So he went to bat, and he found a deal that Paramount would agree with. The deal was Hitch would finance the movie independently, and part of the way to make that budget a little bit lower is that he would make it using his crew from his television show, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which is another way people knew him at this time. But of course, even with the lower production thing from the television crew, it's still Hitch behind the camera, so he's still going to have that eye. So anything that would come from a less experienced crew is going to be balanced out with Hitch. And of course, there's only going to be a couple big name stars, and that would of course be Janet Leigh and Anthony Perkins. Now, Perkins, at the time of his casting here, he was known for like roles, kind of roles around his age range, not quite leading man, but sort of going into the romantic area. And he even got an Academy Award nomination. Of course, Janet Leigh, it's Janet Leigh. And her casting would be what we would consider stunt casting because of what happens to her character, but is part of what makes this film work. Is that you start seeing her, and then the shower scene happens, and you're like, dang! Now, the fun thing I like is that Anthony Perkins, for his role, was paid $40,000, which is the amount of money that's stolen in the film, so you gotta love that. Now, the plot of the film, it's set in contemporary Phoenix, Arizona. We're introduced to our main character, Marion Crane, who is Janet Leigh's character. She's having a romantic tryst, a little slip of the tongue there, in a motel room with her boyfriend, Sam Loomis. Now, it's the aftermath. They're getting dressed, they're the whole thing of not wanting to leave the room, and they're all doing their little afterwards pillow talk. Marion wants to marry Sam, but Sam is hesitant for two reasons. One, inherited debt from his father, which I don't know if this is something that only Arizona allows or if it's something that was back then, but he's inherited a lot of debt from him. And two, alimony to his ex-wife. Now, there's probably also a little subtle thing about him probably wondering if he wants to get married again, but that's more an individual reading into it. Marion really wants to, he doesn't. They have a little back and forth conversation about it. Marion goes back to work, and she works as a secretary in a real estate office. Her boss just closed a deal on a place for $40,000, and the guy paid it in cash. And the actor that plays this guy, perfect. I just love how smug he is. I don't carry more than I can afford to lose. And of course, it means that he openly commits tax evasion. Well, I do declare, I don't. That's why I get to keep it. Ooh. And that's the reason why people hate some rich people. That's not paying their fair share, but I digress. Now, Marion, the moment she sees the money, you can kind of see the wheels turning in her head. And the first scene after she leaves work really sells it. And the thing I love about this scene is it is all visual. Perfect example of visual storytelling, especially with Hitch behind the camera. And it's a prime example of when Hitch moves his camera, it's always intentional, and he's showing you what he wants the audience to see. There is no unnecessary panning, especially at this point in his career. We see that Marion has her suitcase packed. There's the money. And we just pan around the room. And one little nice little thing here is that the first scene we see her in the hotel room, her undergarments are white. Here, they are black. That would the next scene tell you that, oh, she's stealing the money. And as she's driving out of Phoenix, you can tell that she is wrestling with the moral implications of her decision, and it's making her a little paranoid. When she runs in with the highway patrol, you can tell she's really getting paranoid. And of course, the actor that plays the highway patrol officer does a really good job of showing that he suspected something, and nice little contrast between the two of them. They work off each other well. Of course, when she gets out of town, she's really thinking about what everyone's going to be thinking of her, especially the rich guy when he finds out she absconded with the money. I'll replace you with her nice soft flesh. Of course, driving through the rain, and she decides to stop for the night at the Bates Motel, and this is where we're introduced to Anthony Perkins in the movie. And Anthony Perkins, I have to applaud his performance because he is really likable here. You really do like him. And even before his casting, changing the Norman Bates character from middle-aged to more like late 20s, early 30s works a lot better because it does allow the audience to feel a little bit more sympathy for him later on. But of course, you take that change and you put Anthony in the role, perfect. Now he has a nice little back and forth chemistry with Janet Leigh in this little scene. You see, being nice, friendly, and all that, and you can definitely tell that he does like her, but it seems like he's going to do his job thing. And then, of course, we're introduced to his part of his predicament where we hear the voice of Mother, good old Norma Bates. And let's see, I have her actress written here. Virginia Gregg is the one who voiced her, and she does a perfect job. Right amount of age in the voice, and right amount of overbearingness in her tone and her enunciation. You really feel for Norman when we see this initial part of his predicament, and Marion really does do it, and it's the way that he shoots it. And the conversation that Norman and Marion have in the parlor that he has in the back of his office, you can really tell that there's something not quite right with Norman, but we don't know what it is. At this point, we think it's because he didn't cut the apron strings because of his mother, which is someone that lived at home with their grandmother who raised them until she passed away. I kind of get. I mean, sometimes due to your circumstances, you can't quite move out, especially when they're sick, so I do get Norman's predicament there. Many differences, whereas my grandmother was nice and loving, Norma Bates, from what we see here, a clinging, demanding woman. Now, things that they part nicely. Marion's deciding she's going to go home, deal with consequences, turn herself in. And she's showering, which there's a lot of symbolism in there with how it's shot. Like, oh, she's cleansing herself of her sins here. And then she gets attacked, and we get the infamous shower scene. So many videos and essays have been written about this scene, dissecting it. There's a lot to be said here. But what I really love about it is its combination of imagery with the music. Because the images alone, very effective, mainly because of how they cross-cut and the fact you never actually see the knife penetrate. Part of that is because we were still in the film censorship era. But it also shows the theater of the mind can be a lot more effective. Because with how it's cut and how it switches from all the angles, we think we see the knife in her, but the closest we see is when the knife slides around her stomach. Other than that, it's just all theater of the mind with editing. And then, of course, you throw Bernard Herrmann's wonderful score over it. I mean, the violins, they're shrieking, and it's like they're emulating the sound that metal makes when it slides against something. So it really goes with it. And of course, once the stabbing's over, it kind of segues into the ending thing. Dun dun. Dun dun. And the fact that you mainly just see the character in silhouette, the killer, with the darkened face, really does help it. And this is really what helps hide the twist at the end. Now, just to say, before I get to talk about the twist, for all the scenes involving Mother, none of the actors who played the principal roles were involved in it. It was all stunt doubles. That helps hide it. Now, of course, after the murder, we hear Norman go, "Mother, mother, blood," which shows, okay, maybe Norman's the murderer. And he goes down, and like a dutiful son, he decides to cover it up. What helps sell that is Norman's reaction when he finds Marion's body, where it looks like he's about to get sick to his stomach, but he composes himself, closes the door, and does what he has to do. He covers up the murder. And throughout this whole thing, we're really seeing even more what his situation is that before, it looked like, oh, Mother is over clinging, she's demanding, she's overbearing. Sorry about that. But then after that, with this, we're like, okay, now we see even more. She's willing to kill in order to keep her claws in her son against someone, even if there is no chance that that person's going to take the son at all. And of course, Norman, being the dutiful son, is going to cover up, because as he said, my mother there. And that's an insane asylum. her going to prison at her age, in her condition, even worse. So he does what he does. And of course, when he tries to get rid of the car, it doesn't fully sink for a moment. It's like, uh-oh, he's going to get caught, but then it sinks. And the thing that I love, not one little tick I love that Perkins incorporated into Norman, is him always snacking on candy corn. And he does a little bit in this scene. And he pauses and all that little idiosyncrasies about it. That really helps this part of the character. When a individual disappears with $40,000 from their place of work, that's going to get reported right away. And even outside the reporting, people related to the person who absconds are going to be worried and try to find them. And that's what happens here. Because Marion's sister Lila, played by Vera Miles, goes to the town where Sam lives and goes to talk to him at his place of work because she thinks Marion went there. And of course, Sam's like us. He has no idea what she's talking about, has no idea she's there. And then we're introduced to the detective character Arbogast, played by Martin Balsam, who shows up feeling that Marion might have got there, and he keeps investigating and looking, and he goes to the Bates Motel, and he starts poking holes in the cover story that Norman has, and you can see, like, okay, I'm going to see what this is going to go to. Now, he does not like the fact that none of Norman's story is adding up, especially when he caught him in a couple minor lies. Now, of course, since he's a private investigator and not a actual law enforcement, there's only so much you can do. If it was law enforcement that found them, he probably would have taken them down to the station and had a little chat with them there, but that's another scenario. Now, Arbogast decides to go back and have a word with Mrs. Bates because he sees her in the window. And he's going up the stairs, and this is the other famous scene with how it's shot, and that, of course, is the staircase murder. Now, what I love about this is how it's all put together, with Arbogast going up the stairs, him looking around a little bit, us seeing the door crack, then going to the top shot, him looking around, Norma coming out with the knife, and then going to stab, and then the famous part where Arbogast caught off guard, and with everything, he goes backwards, and he's falling backwards, and the camera's following. You can just imagine how much of a nightmare it must have been for Hitch to line that shot up and get it ready, like, ooh. But it's very effective, and it adds a little bit of a sense of, I don't know if I'd say claustrophobia, but it definitely makes you squirm a little bit in your seats, because it's like, it makes you feel uneasy. And then, of course, with his landing, him getting finished off, we all know that now Bates is going to have to dispose of another body, which he does. Now, after Arbogast doesn't return, because he had called Lila to tell him what he'd found at the Bates Motel, they go and talk with the sheriff, Sheriff Chambers, played by John McIntyre, who also voiced Rufus in The Rescuers. And here we get a little bit more backstory, where apparently Mrs. Bates has been dead, and the whole conversation goes, and it ends on the line. And this is a nice little bit of foreshadowing, like, that old lady up there is Mrs. Bates. Who's that lady buried out in Longhorn Cemetery? Now, the whole story that he tells us is that Norma died from a murder-suicide where she was seeing somebody else and killed them both with strychnine, and Norman found them in bed. Now, part of this is true, so keep that in mind for later when I actually talk about the twist. Because normally I put a spoiler thing, but this film is over 60 years old, and like I mentioned, the twist is kind of part of the cultural zeitgeist by this point. Now, after the sheriff goes and doesn't find anything, Lila and Sam decide to go, and they decide to register as a husband and wife at the motel and to go into it. Now, this is the time to bring up another little thing from the book that was cut out, and that was that there was kind of a budding romance between Sam and Lila at this point in the story, which they decided to cut from the film, mainly because they would make it seem like Sam was a little bit of a player, which I get, but how it is here, you can definitely tell they're worried about Marion and all that. Though I must mention that the sequel, Psycho 2, makes it clear that these two did marry after the fact, which I can see, because grief manifests in different ways, and with these two I could see it bringing them together and eventually them falling in love and getting married and all that. Although I can imagine at one point it might have felt a little weird for Lila that she's sleeping with the same person her sister did, but hey, like I said, grief and all. Now they register. They start poking around the hotel. They find a little bit of evidence that Norman forgot to clean up. and Sam goes to distract Norman. Lila sneaks into the house. Eventually Norman and Sam come to blows and Sam gets knocked the fuck out. He runs back into the house. Lila goes and hides in the fruit cellar, which is where Norman moved Mother. Which, to speak about that scene, I love how that scene is, how the camera goes up into the corner, bird's eye view, which birds is one of the themes of this film. I mean, Norman is a taxidermist of birds. And I have to agree with his whole thing. I think that birds look a little bit better stuffed than any other type of critter. There's just kind of a nobility about them when they're stuffed. It's all like Sam the Eagle type thing. Now, anyway, back to that thing. She goes down and she finds Mrs. Bates, and this is where the twist ending is, which it's such a simple shot from how it looks, but this ending reveal shot, when you actually watch it, it makes you wonder just how many when you realize how many elements are in play here, you realize just how complicated this shot would have been. Because with the reveal is that the sheriff was right. Norma is dead, and what we have in the chair is her treated but decomposing corpse, no eyes and all that, just desecrated body. Now, and of course Lila screams, and then of course we find out the killer is actually Norman in drag. Dress, wig. He gets interrupted from another murder by Sam, and they get the knife out of his hands. And of course we get the infamous score again, but all the elements in this scene that you have to think of, it's Lila touching the body in this chair swinging around, and then because of her reaction, her hand going up and hitting the light above it, it's swinging, and it doing with the light when it does the back shot on the body. Just all those elements, you got to get it just right. It just makes me wonder how many takes Hitch had to do with that scene. And then we get probably the one scene in the movie for the denouement that has not aged the best, and mainly that's because it is all exposition to explain the plot. Now, it does have its origins in a part in the novel, from what I understand, but they change it from Sam being the one to do it, which I'm like, okay, it's a little weird that Sam would do it, to having a psychiatrist do it. And of course, the psychiatrist in this scene, let me bring my notes back up, is played by Simon Oakland, who played Schrank in Skrank, excuse me, I'm just going off how it's spelled, Schrank in West Side Story. And he has a perfect voice for this type of character, so that I don't mind, but definitely doesn't seem like it's aged the best because of how he has to explain everything, and considering how Hitchcock has played with this film being a lot on imagery, it seems a little weird. But considering the twist, it kind of seems like you do need an exposition scene. And he explains the whole bit of psychology about Norman and his mother, tying, of course, back into its roots and being inspired by Ed Gein, even if only subconsciously, about how she was a demanding woman. They lived together, they were fine. And of course, once she met the man who talked her into building the hotel, there's a little bit of an Oedipus complex there where he got jealous because old mother's put me over for this. And one night he killed them both. Now it's very, very short explained, but in the universe of the films, they do later explain it a bit more in Psycho 4. Even, of course, that's following in the footsteps of the convoluted thing they did between 2 and 3, but that's just me going off reading the synopsis. Maybe it doesn't seem so convoluted when I actually watch it, but it seems a little convoluted to me. And they actually explain it more in Psycho 4, as I was saying. And, of course, since it was matricide, he felt so guilty that he decided to go steal the body. But as the doctor put it, she was there, but she was a corpse. So, due to his psychological issues, Norman gave his mother half of his life. Now, the movie doesn't explain it as well here, but when he did this, Norman technically develops 3 personalities. There's normal Norman, there is the part of him when Mother's there, when they're conversing, and then there's full Norma when he fully turns into Mother. And that's what happens when he turns the door and she goes and does her murders. Now, in the book, he only does that when he gets blasted drunk, which is another character element they took out, is that he is a alcoholic in the books. But here they took that away, which I think makes it a little bit more tragic, because Norman now really has no control over when he turns into that full Norma personality. Now, the way they explain it in the movie is that, for the most part, it's the mixed one. But then there are times where he fully turns into his mother. As the doctor puts, he was never always Norman, but he was often only mother. And it's in those moments where jealousy would tie in, because it's the whole back and forth with the psychology and all that, which is why Norma, as we hear, is the way she is, and why she did what she did to Marion and any other woman that Norman would feel attracted to. Which, of course, when it comes to the fourth film, makes me wonder what that side of him would have done if she were to come back and find out he was married, but that's a whole other thing. And now, because of everything, it looks like Norma is now in complete control of the body. And it looks like because of all this, he is going to go to the place he needs to go to, which is a mental institution, which is also where Ed Gein went. I mean, he was also convicted of the murders. I haven't seen the second film, so I don't know if he was actually convicted of the murders or they just put him in there. But most of the time when someone is committed, after they've committed heinous crimes like murder, it's usually for the rest of their life. Because if they're deranged to the point where they're going to be able to commit heinous acts like that, why would they be released? Now, the final scene of the movie is a scene of Anthony Perkins sitting there in character while his inner thoughts, his mother, are playing over his head. And it ends on the final line, "She wouldn't even harm a fly," which, combined with how they do the reverberation and the smile on Anthony Perkins' face, perfect way to end it, especially with the little cross dissolve of mother's face over his face, and then going into the final shot where they pull the car out of the muck. Perfect way to end this film. Now, the cast all do a great job, but of course, I got to give Anthony Perkins a lot of the props since he's the one that carries this film after Marion gets killed. Now, sadly, like I mentioned earlier with the roles he would get before, after this film, a lot of those roles dried up. Because this is a film that sadly typecast him. Now later on, he did kind of go and lean into it a little bit when he did the sequels and even directed the fourth one. But it's sad that he was typecast because of this. I mean, sometimes typecasting works with actors going and doing mainly like genre films, but for Perkins to get typecast and only doing Norman type roles, that's sad. Now, I kind of have to bring this up when it comes to inspiration he might have had for how he handled his role here. It's not a lot, but there's the whole thing about what was his Anthony Perkins' sexuality in real life. There's a lot of thing about him possibly being a closeted gay man or closeted bisexual. There's a lot of back and forth on there. A part of that was he did not have intercourse with a woman until he was 39, 4 years older than I am now. And in his later years, he was married and he did have at least one child, if I remember right. But then there's that whole thing of, hey, it could have just been a cover, considering that back in this time period, there wasn't a lot of people who could be openly gay in Hollywood and not have it affect their career. There were people, like the legendary James Whale. He was openly gay, didn't really affect his career too much. But others, especially in this era, following the Red Scare and all the people getting blacklisted because of their communist or supposed communist ties, I can see why people would have to be a little bit more on the down low with that. Now, whether he was one or the other, we're about to say if he was a member of the LGBTQ community, I could see, even if only subconsciously, him drawing a little bit from his frustrations, from all different types of emotions he could be feeling about having to hide that side of himself, and putting it in with Norman. I don't know if he did or not, because obviously Perkins is not alive now. We can't really ask him questions about what type of inspiration he drew, but it's something that we can speculate on. And of course, Janet Leigh's Marion, excellent job. Nice little bit for the way she's there. She really does sell it with her vocal delivery, even though from what I hear, there's a couple parts they had to shoot multiple times because of how her pronunciation on lines with some lines she couldn't pronounce, which I get. I mean, for the longest time after I first heard the word, I couldn't say the word philanthropist, and sometimes I even have to try to put it in my mind. Now I can say it fine, but I can't even try to pronounce it how I used to mispronounce it. It was just one of those ones that would get me all tongue-tied. I could say philanthropy fine, but I couldn't say philanthropist. Something about those last little change in syllables that would get me. Of course, the screenplay is by Joseph Stefano from the novel. Now, Stefano he doesn't really have anything else of note to mention in his filmography. I mean, there's some stuff I can bring up, but nothing like jumps out at me. Now, Stefano, I think one thing that really does cinch it when it comes to him writing the screenplay was the fact that he was in therapy at the time, and one of the issues was his mother. So it looks like he drew a little bit from that when it came to him taking the novel, turning it into this film, and some of the changes he made, including, of course, like I mentioned, aging Norman down. And of course, combine that with the cast and with Hitchcock's excellent direction, like I already mentioned about some of the camera angles and all that, and of course Herman's score on top of it, you got an excellent film. Now, it was made for $806,947 in 1959 to 1960s money, which now would be over $8.5 million, which is a small budget compared to how much the budgets for his previous films were, which, last I saw, were like around $4 million each. Doesn't seem a lot now, but remember, if under $1 million, if over 800,000 is over $8 million, do the math, that'd probably be more like, probably like 40 million budget today, give or take. Maybe 20 million. I'd say probably more 40, which is still a smallish film, but that's only when you're adjusting for inflation. But if you go by like the size of the budgets, be a lot bigger. But this is also before we really were getting super large scale budgets on the films again, other than just like the occasional musical, and even then they wouldn't make a lot of money. And its gross back in the day was 32 million. Now that, even going by Hollywood math, pretty large gross, which now that'd be it making 340 million. A lot of good one there. Okay, now for the trivia, one of my favorite parts. Oh yeah, before I go to it, the cinematographer that Hitch worked on here was John L. Russell, who, like I mentioned, was one of his Hitchcock Presents cinematographers. He worked on 21 episodes of it, and he also worked on The Man from Planet X, if I remember right. Oh, I guess I didn't put the rest of it in there. Now, some interesting little bits of trivia. On the first day, the cast and crew had to raise their right hands and swear on oath not to divulge one word of the story. And of course, he also withheld the ending part of the script until they needed to shoot it. Now, the thing about that is that for trained actors, that would be a little hard because they wouldn't know where their character would be going throughout the story. Now, I would like to imagine he at least clued Perkins in a little bit on what happens at the end so he could go with his character a little bit. But even without that, the way that Anthony plays it definitely helps with the rest of the film. Alright. Hitchcock actually bought the rights anonymously from Robert Bloch for only $9,000. And Hitch would do this repeatedly just to try to keep the money amount low that he would buy them for. Now sometimes when the author would find out about it, they'd be like, oh, if I knew it was Hitchcock doing it, I would give him the rights for free. And that's the thing you'll find about Hitch, is that a lot of his movies, especially in this part of his career, are adapted from short stories and novels. And of course there are some changes, but of course sometimes you got to do that when you adapt it. Sometimes it's necessary. Like here, the changes definitely help the film a bit more. And a fun little moment, and this is always brought up with this film, is that after this movie's release, Hitch received an angry letter from the father of a girl who, after seeing Diabolique in 1955, had refused to take a bath, and now she refused to take a shower after seeing this. And Hitch, his response to this really shows his sense of humor, and I have to applaud him for this. And that, of course, is he sent back a note that said, send her to the dry cleaners. Hitch, I just love his dry sense of humor like that. Like, there's a lot of stories. When I review more of his films, I'll have to share more of them. Like, the directing one definitely is one of my favorite ones. All in all, Psycho, definitely a classic film. And one thing I have not touched on in this film yet is that technically you could put this as a progenitor of the slasher films. Now, I've put on with the Mummy films, the Karras ones, that you can consider that the first slasher series, even though there's no slasher kills in it. But with all the other tropes it follows, that it sets it, even if later people who were following it were doing it subconsciously. This is a film that you could say is the progenitor of it. Now, I wouldn't quite say it is a slasher film, that's why I'm using the word progenitor. But it does have a little bit of a body count. The killer does wear a costume. They primarily use a knife. Does kind of have a twist at the end, but you don't really need a twist per se for a slasher film. Some of them do, some of them don't. but it only lays the brief groundwork. It's not until Texas Chainsaw, maybe a little bit with Black Christmas, that we start to get a little bit more of the codification of those elements, but it's not until Halloween proper that we got the full codification, and then boom, slasher film. There we go. So this is like the Jurassic period of that concept. And of course it's made by an auteur, so you got that a little bit. Because sometimes with some slasher films you got directors that have good eyes and all that, but they're not auteurs. So it's not going to be the same, because under our auteur theory, and this is something I have to agree with, is that the worst film by an auteur is usually going to be better than the best film by a non-auteur. Take of that what you will. Definitely a film I recommend if you have not seen it. If you have not seen it, but you do know about the spoilers I mentioned due to the cultural zeitgeist, I would go and do it with the mindset that just push those little things you know about it to the back of your mind and watch it with an open mind. Now, there's a chance you still might not like it, or it might seem very derivative and all that, but sadly, with some older films in Hollywood, that's going to happen. I mean, just look at Casablanca. A lot of the stuff that it started went into other films, and some of the bits of dialogue do seem cliche with it, but it's the things that started it. So if you watch the film with that in mind, it goes a lot better. Here, same thing with Psycho. And of course, if you've seen some of Hitch's other films, even though the budget's lower here, you can still see a lot of his tropes there, and it does help make the film a lot very enjoyable. Now, I don't know if I'd say this is Hitch's last masterpiece, because he did make a couple films after this. I think one of them, if I remember right, was Marty, which that's a film that's going to be interesting when I revisit it and touch on it, because I haven't seen it in 20 years, but this is definitely one of his better films going into the last half of his career. Because there's a couple of his films after this that are talked about, but a couple others that aren't, other than like some interesting blurbs. That's all I got to talk about. Till next time, everybody.